I called the book Widgets because it seemed the best way to encapsulate a fairly pernicious idea that people are resources, human resources. They're not. They are real people. Someone's son or daughter, brother or sister, mom or dad. And there are too many times when a leader of an organization says something like, people are our greatest assets. Well, they're not assets. They're not yours, and they're not assets. You don't own them. You own your other assets in the organization. You don't own your people. And they're due a certain amount of respect and dignity and proper treatment, given the fact that they're not assets, they're not human resources, and they for darn sure are not widgets. And the quicker we get ourselves recalibrated to understanding the proper relationship that ought to be between people and the companies where they work, the better off those people will be, and the better off those companies will be. Human nature hasn't changed, but the conditions that people find themselves in have changed. So much has occurred in the last decade. We have social media. We have millennials entering the workplace and becoming a substantial proportion. We have the lingering effects of the Great Recession. We have money that is much less patient to stay invested in one organization or another. The commitment of organizations to their employees over the long term has decreased. And therefore, we need to have an approach, a strategy, an implicit social contract, if you will, with employees that takes into account that we're under very different conditions than we were even 10 years ago. I circulated the early chapters of Widgets to a senior executive for his reaction. And he wrote a note back to me and said, you didn't say this in the chapter, but your tone is kind of harsh, and I'm getting the impression that you are saying that people are good and companies are bad. I thought about that for a while. It was not a message that I intended to send, even if implicitly. And so I rewrote parts of that chapter, and I included an observation in there that companies are powerful and people are reciprocal. And so because of that, the conditions that an organization sets up largely determine the way in which people will respond. And that's why it's so important that leaders and managers get this right. People are reciprocal, and if you look out for them, they will look out for your organization. If you neglect them, then they will feel somewhat justified in, to some degree, neglecting the organization. I'm critical of most employee engagement approaches because of a number of unintended consequences that have built in over the last 10 years or so. In many cases, the surveys are not truly confidential. In some cases, when people give very candid answers and they're in frustrating situations, their motivations are questioned. In many cases, they're out of date. They're often done just once a year and not much is done with the results. They don't give feedback to the employee about what his or her answers to these very sensitive questions say about their situation. And because of this, they tend to be check-the-box exercises that really don't have any kind of a return for the organization or for the individual that they could have. And that's a sad thing, given the fact that most employees are very eager to do a good job for the organization and under the right circumstances would share their honest opinions with the company. I'm not sure that most leaders of organizations understand how much of their employees' bearing is within their own control. Not because they're controlling their employees, but because people are so reciprocal. So I know that if they are generous, if they recognize their employees, if they give them a sense of accomplishment, if they give them managers who get inside their heads and look after them, that the vast majority of employees will reciprocate that with their best efforts. And so because of that, a company gets the engagement that it deserves. And because engagement is so closely tied to performance, ultimately the company gets the performance that it deserves.